Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 48. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today, we want to ask the question, where does information come from? Is it something that can come about randomly, or is it something that is that has its initial source in a mind? We're going to begin by talking about a video I watched recently, an interview on uncommon knowledge, which I guess you could call it a podcast where Peter Robinson interviews various people. And he had an interview last year with Dr. Stephen Meyer and Dr. James Tour, and they talked about some of the origin of life experiments and some of the downfalls of so-called chemical evolution and biological evolution. Now, these are concepts that many scientists will say are scientific, but upon further inspection, they just really aren't. And this is what Meyer and Tour get at in the interview. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then talk about some of the concepts that they mentioned in the interview. One was related to information in DNA and in the cell. And we have to ask the question, what do we do with that? What do we do with the fact that we find information there, that we see it encoded in DNA, for instance? What do we do with the fact that you can take that information and then it is in the form of instructions that can be used in the cell? Do we simply say that that entire system of information and communication came about randomly, or is there perhaps another explanation? We will also look at creating life, the idea of life coming from non life. We've mentioned it on this channel. That idea is called abiogenesis, and we see that it rails against the law of biogenesis. But we want to see exactly, and we're going to just look some things up online. So I don't have any idea what's going to come up, but we're going to look and see what's online and really try to answer that. We'll talk a little bit about origin of life experiments like the Miller-Urey experiment from, I guess it was in the 50s, nearly 70 years ago, I guess, and how basically nothing of substance has happened since then. And even that didn't do what it's often claimed to have done. And finally, we'll talk about the bias against intelligent design. Part of what we talk about on this channel is intelligent design versus evolution. And evolution is a viewpoint. It's a belief system that is heavily pushed in school and in the scientific community. And yet there really isn't a good reason for it to be that way, except that people don't want to believe in God. They don't want to even allow for that to be a possibility. So let's start with the interview with Peter Robinson and his interview with Stephen Meyer and Dr. James Tour. And so what I'm going to do here is just kind of show you over here to the left the YouTube video where you can find that. And so it is, the name of the YouTube video is Beyond Evolution: Unraveling the Origins of Life with Stephen Meyer and James Tour. And so this is, again, was back nearly a year ago, August of 2024. Stephen Meyer is the director of the, it says here he's the director of the Discovery Institute. I'm not sure if that's exactly right. I think he's the director of the Center for Science and Culture um, at the Discovery Institute. And he is the author of the book, The Return of the High God Hypothesis. He's also written a book called Signature in the Cell, and Darwin's Doubt, I believe, is the name of another of his books. And really, he has gotten more vocal in his willingness to say that he believes in God and that intelligent design ultimately points to the God of the Bible, I believe he would say. So uh, James Tour, which we've done a video about James Tour in the past, he is an organic chemist. He's a professor at Rice University. And his thing is he's not so much trying to speak for intelligent design arguments, but he simply, one of the things he shows, it's interesting. It's one way to think of him is as an origin of life agnostic, meaning that part of what he shows in his work and in some of the papers that he's written is that we just don't know how things came to be. And what he means there is how specifically he is a believer. He would believe in the God of the Bible, But what he's saying is that from a science perspective, we do not know how things came to be, despite the lip service that is often paid to evolution. The the amount of confidence that people are placing in it is far overstated with respect to what we actually can see and what we actually know. And this is something he is very big on pointing out. And so in this interview, they really talked about two forms of evolution. Usually on this channel, I talk about biological evolution specifically, but they talked about both biological evolution and then they really moved over to chemical evolution, which you can think of chemical evolution as basically being akin to the idea of abiogenesis, that chemically life could have come to exist and evolved into its existence from non living uh, materials. That's essentially what chemical evolution is getting at. So that's what they talked about this in this interview, and they really went deeply into that. I think Peter Robinson was really trying to push for them both to be a little bit more forceful in their denial of evolution and in their willingness to say that there is a God, that the God of the Bible is the one that made all of these things. But as a scientist in the case of Dr. James Tour, and as a historian of science in the case of Dr. Stephen Meyer, they also want to be very careful. Of course, there are going to be people that look very closely at these kinds of interviews, and if they say anything that's off, then it'll be very easy for people to come at them and try to pick at or nitpick the things that they say. So they are very careful, particularly in the case of Dr. Tour, to not say something that they cannot really point to scientifically. So, one of the things that Stephen Meyer gets at in many of his talks, really beginning with Signature in the Cell, that book, and then moving eventually to Return of the God hypothesis, is that we can look at the existence of information in DNA and in the cell, and we can point to the fact that we don't see specified information in this sense anywhere. We don't see that kind of information originate anywhere except minds that do it, intelligences that do this. So it would help to define information and give you a sense of what information is. So one way to think about information is just to say, oh, okay, well, if I write down the word apple, then that is talking about this piece of fruit that we can pick off of a tree. And maybe it's red, or maybe it's green, or maybe it's yellow, but that's what an apple is. And it usually has anywhere from a sweet to a tart taste and has little seeds in the middle of it. And that's what an apple is. And so when I say the word apple, I am conveying some information. Now, one of the things that Meyer often points out is that there is what's called Shannon information. And so, as I'm talking about this, let me make sure that I'm going to going to show you some of these things. I'm going to go to these other tabs later, but right now I want to show you what Shannon information is. Shannon information is named after Claude Shannon, who was an information scientist is not the best term for it. Here it calls him a mathematician and an electrical engineer, and he is someone that formalized much of what we see in terms of information theory. So if we go to this Wikipedia page that's talking about information content, this gives us a pretty good sense of what information means. So what is called Shannon information is based on the probability that a particular event can occur from a random variable. You say, okay, Jerry, what do you mean by that? Well, again, if you think about a random variable, let's say a sequence of letters that are, again, so our English, the English alphabet has 26 letters. And so let's say you had a 5-letter word and you wanted to come up with a word based on those 26 letters of the English alphabet. Okay, well, basically, to tell the number of possible combinations, you would just simply take 26 and raise it to the fifth power. Now, let me again do this. We're doing this in real time. If we look for a calculator online and we take 26 and we raise it to the fifth power, that gives us a value of 11.9 million different combinations, meaning that for the first letter of this five-letter word, then if that first letter could be anything between A and Z, and the second letter could be anything between A and Z, and the third letter could be anything between A and Z, and go on through the five letters, then there are 11.88 million combinations that you could possibly have. So, for example, you could have A, right? You could have B, 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 C, 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 and then you could have, again, all of the different combinations in between. There are 11.88 million, and that's just for a five-letter word. Now, the point is, if you were to look at those 11.88 million different combinations of letters, there are actually only a few of them that would constitute a word that we would recognize. And this gets at the idea of information. Because there are so few of those five-letter words that can actually mean something, like the word apple, you would have A-P-P-L-E, right? But imagine if it said B-P-R-L-E, that you just changed two of the letters. Now it means absolutely nothing. BRPLE doesn't mean anything. If you take the first and the third letters and you change them, then what meant apple now doesn't mean anything. In fact, you could do that by changing any of the letters. In fact, you could change one letter and it could mean something completely different. So let's say you had the word apple, A-P-P-L-E, and then you changed it to A-P-P-L-Y. Well, the first word is apple, but the next word is apply, A-P-P-L-Y. Well, those mean two separate things. One is a piece of fruit, and the other is a verb that could mean something like apply for a job or apply to go to a certain school or to apply oneself. Those means two separate things. And so when we're thinking about information, information has a lot to do with having, if you take a random variable like a five-letter sequence, then information has to do with an arrangement of that such that you couldn't randomly get this sequence. You have to intentionally give that in order to convey information, you have to intentionally sequence those letters APPLE or APPLY to get the information that you want. And if it's very easy to get something that means something, then it really isn't information. So for example, let's take that down to a three-letter word. Let's say you have a three-letter word, but in this case, let's say we're only going to use four of the letters of the alphabet. Okay. So instead of using all 26 letters of the alphabet, imagine that you have four letters of the alphabet and it is a three-letter sequence. Notice that then you will only have 64 potential combinations. So let's say you take A, B, C, D, and from those three letters, you will create various words. You'll notice that there's a lot higher probability of you actually coming up with a word that means something than if you had that five-letter word. And so then if you go out to a six-letter word or a 10-letter word, the numbers get even higher. So we just mentioned that 26 to the fifth power is 11.88 million. But imagine you took 26 and you raised it to the 10th power. Now you're talking about a number that's astronomically high, meaning you can't just randomly come up with a 10-letter word again, if you're just randomly choosing letters from the alphabet, the longer the word gets, the more remote the possibility that you're going to come up with information there randomly. So I could randomly come up with something like BAD. You get a 1 in 64 chance of BAD using those four letters of the English alphabet, A through D. and only using 3 letters, right? So I can easily come up with things that mean something when I have a shorter sequence. Now, all of this has to do with something like DNA in the cell, because when you look at DNA and you look at the sequences of letters, let's call them, but to be technical, we're talking about nucleotide bases, and the 4 nucleotide bases are denoted by A, T, G, and C, and those stand for adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, I believe. I'm actually just doing this off the top of my head. I don't remember. What are the DNA nucleotide bases? Adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine. So that advanced placement biology from years ago comes in handy. So most people know the A, G, C, and T, and that's what that is referring to. Those 4, and so they are arranged in a way to where there's code. And again, we're not talking about a code of 3 or 4 letters, but we're talking about codes that are many dozens, if not hundreds, of letters long. And so, as we just mentioned, the higher that number of letters gets, the longer that number of letters gets, the more unlikely you can just randomly come up with something that will encode information. So we see this in DNA and we see this in the cell. And the question becomes, if I come across something that has information, what am I to make of that? Well, after a certain number of letters, it becomes just the probabilities become so remote that you could come up with something randomly that means something, that you begin to get to a place where it just doesn't make sense anymore. And so this is what we're getting at with this. Now, if we think about this from the perspective of DNA in the cell, you really have 2 options. Either DNA and in the information that we find in DNA in the cell came about through random processes, which we've just mentioned is basically a 0 probability of something like that happening, or someone encoded the information, someone created the information. And of course, we advocate for intelligent design, that someone did that. Now, the problem that we're going to continue to run up against is that if you were to say something like that, there are many people that say that that's anti-scientific or it's unscientific. But what we want to contend in this podcast and just repeatedly is that it's actually unscientific and anti-scientific to eliminate as a possibility the idea of intelligence or the idea of design when the evidence so clearly points to it. So if you go into all of your dealings with these things and you say, well, it can't mean that, then you're going to negate a potential possibility. And that's not scientific. That's actually the opposite of being scientific. Okay. So next, if we look at how to create life, one of the things that they talked about in the interview there, James Tour repeated this multiple times, is he said, we just don't know. We don't know how to create life. And so when people speak as if they do know how to create life, that is just the opposite of what we actually find. And so it's interesting. I typed in James Tour Origin of Life, and it's interesting to go to Google now and have Google Gemini give you a sense of what it gives you an AI overview, right? So it's not just Googling it. It gives you it basically runs your Google search through Google Gemini. And so here it says here that Dr. Tour is known for his critical stance on the origin of life research and his debates with scientists in the field. He argues that current scientific theories on the emergence of life lack sufficient explanation for key chemical processes. He has challenged researchers to explain specific problems related to the formation of basic biological molecules like amino acids, nucleotides, and polymers. Now, if you go down and look at the alternative perspective, it says that his stance on the origin of life is often framed within the context of his Christian faith and his belief that life is too complex to have arisen spontaneously. Now, the idea that that's something that is, uh, well, you have to be a Christian to see that life is too complex to have risen spontaneously is part of the issue here. That if someone is a Christian and they are willing to speak on that and claim to be so openly, there are people that will try to completely negate or downplay their scientific credentials. And he's someone that, according to the interview, has published over 1,000 peer-reviewed research papers and articles. And so he clearly understands the chemistry. He clearly has a background in this, but there are people that would be completely willing to dismiss him simply because he is a Christian, or he claims to be a Christian, or he claims to believe in the God of the Bible. Just claiming that is something that people will say dismisses them as being any kind of scientific authority. Now, what's interesting is being an atheist apparently has nothing to do with any of this. You can be an atheist and it's just fine. So your background, your belief system matters in one case, but it doesn't matter in the other case. And there's never really any explanation given as to why that would be the case. So he talks often about the fact that the origin of life research is being well funded, and yet it's getting no real results. And there's all of this money and taxpayer dollars that are going into working on this stuff. And for what? It's taking us nowhere. We're learning nothing useful, except that scientists are doing all kinds of experiments that really don't get us any closer to understanding how life could have arisen from non-life, how some kind of abiogenesis process could have taken place, or chemical evolution, if you want to use that terminology. So he talks a lot about that kind of thing. And that really brings us to the origin of life experiments. It was interesting. He and Dr. Meyer differ a little bit on this. Dr. James Tour, he doesn't like to call it intelligence behind these experiments that are done, because he says they don't actually come up with anything. They don't produce anything of value. And so when he says that, Dr. Meyer pushes back a little bit, because he says, even if you want to, you can get into this semantic argument of, well, maybe it's not intelligent because they're not actually coming to any good solutions. But what Meyer points out is that these scientists are being very deliberate in how they go about conducting these experiments to try to produce amino acids, for instance. And that because they are doing that, it really points to the necessity of a designer. That if as scientists, you have to be very careful about how you go through these processes of generating amino acids, then that must mean that if they came about at all in some kind of abiogenesis process, that it wasn't completely random. It would have at least had to have been caused by an intelligence, because an intelligence is behind these experiments. So, if anything, these kinds of origin of life experiments, such as the Miller-Urey experiment, that these would have to actually point to intelligent design rather than point away from it. So again, the Miller-Urey experiment, just going over that briefly, was in 1952, and it supposedly simulated the conditions of Earth in the distant past. And the entire idea was to try to show how life might have arisen from non-living matter. So this is, again, abiogenesis. Now, never mind that we've mentioned on multiple occasions that abiogenesis is an anti-scientific idea, that the law of biogenesis says that life comes from life. And so the idea of abiogenesis flies in the face of a natural law of science. And yet people are trying to find this. Why? Because they do not want there to be a God. They do not want there to be someone ultimately who would tell them how they should do and how they should live. Okay, so they supposedly simulated early Earth. They basically sparked this mixture of different gases, and they were able to provide the energy to produce various reactions that produced some things that could be viewed as the building blocks of proteins like amino acids. Now, one of the things that it says here under the AI overview is that the significance of this experiment is that it provided strong evidence that organic molecules essential for life could have formed spontaneously under the conditions of early Earth. Now, in some ways, that's kind of useful to show that, but you have to understand what the implications are. The implications that the thing they are trying to imply is that if building blocks could have formed, then life could have formed also. But one of the things that Dr. James Tour likes to point out is, okay, let's say I give you all of the building blocks. Could you get a cell to work? Could you get DNA to act as it should? Could you get those proteins to form? And the answer is we are not anywhere close to doing anything like that. We're nowhere near it. And so it's not enough to be able to show that potentially you could have had some building blocks. One of the things that Dr. Tour asks when he's talking to scientists, he says, okay, let's say you have a cell and it's alive and then it dies. It's no longer alive. So 2 seconds after it is no longer alive, Dr. Tour simply asks this, okay, how do you get that thing to be alive again? Like, what is that animating force that we call life? What is it exactly? We don't even know that. So the idea that we could reproduce it and we don't even know what it, meaning life, is a problem. It's a big problem, especially if you think that it should be pretty straightforward. If we have the building blocks, we'll be able to create life. No. James Tour says, look, I'll give you all the building blocks. I'll set everything up for you. Produce life. You have no idea what it is to even try to reproduce it. And even if you did know what it was, again, you're not able to reproduce it, but we don't even know what it is. What is it that makes something alive versus being dead? We don't know. And so when something dies, we have no way of just turning around and saying, okay, let's make it alive again. We don't know how to do that. And so again, we go back to the theologians, the philosophers, and ultimately, the Bible says in the book of Genesis, I'll look it up real quick. But when Genesis describes life coming into mankind, the way it's described is that God breathed into the nostrils of Adam the breath of life. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So what is that exactly? Well, we don't know. It is a mystery. But it makes a whole lot more sense that God did that than to say that from non-living materials, life arose. That just doesn't line up with anything that we can see or experience. Okay, so when you look at the Miller-Urey experiment from over 70 years ago, what you find is they showed that you could make some building blocks. But since then, we are no closer. In fact, we are no closer to understanding life. And what James Tour and Stephen Meyer pointed out is that horizon is receding in terms of we actually didn't understand how far away we were. And the more we begin to understand, the more we see that, wow, this is a lot harder. This is a lot more difficult to understand than we previously thought. So as we get to learn more about DNA and about cells, we understand how difficult it is to replicate what God has done. And again, I'm inserting that idea of God, what God has done, but what exists in terms of life. Okay. So I end today. We're going to be shorter today, and we're going to experiment with some shorter podcasts moving forward. Let me know what you think. If you just email me at Jerry, Jerry, at jerryswafford.com. So Jerry at JerrySwafford.com. Let me know what you think about the shorter format. But I end with by talking about what is called the teleological argument, and it's just the argument from design. It's not a it's one of those big words that you're going to find among philosophers. But arguing from teleology means just arguing essentially from telos is comes from the Greek for an end, or um, basically the purpose of a thing. And so if I'm studying so logos is just means word or study. So if something ends in ology, then that basically means the study of something. So teleology has to do with the study of the end of a thing, or the study of a purpose of a thing. So the idea of design is when you design something, it has a purpose, it has an end that it was made for. And what we're saying is when we look at things in the universe, when we look at the existence of life, and when we look at complex life specifically, we see ends, we see purposes. And that is best expressed from the perspective of design. And it is not expressed from the perspective of randomness. See, even when you look at something like purpose, that there is information encoded in that somehow. That when you look at a watch or when you look at a computer, you understand that there is something that's being communicated there. And again, the best way to understand the existence of specified information is to see a designer, is to say that someone designed this, someone made this to be this way, for this purpose, for this end. And so the idea of the teleological argument is thousands of years old. It really goes all the way back to the beginning. And so in modern times, there's this bias against intelligent design because people immediately say, oh, you're trying to say that God's there. Well, I think there are guys that are trying to publish papers like Dr. Meyer and Dr. Tour who I don't think those guys care as much about being cast out. But for those who are trying to publish, then that's a very real difficulty when people are really trying to blackball you or keep you from publishing papers and making a livelihood or whatever, or publish your research as you would like to. But the bias is not scientific. We need to be clear here. And we need to stop allowing people to say that in the name of science, they are rejecting a viable explanation for how things have come to be. This bias isn't scientific. And when you go back to the origins of modern science, everybody understood teleology. In fact, they would call it natural theology at times to think about how God made the world in the way that he did. And so the modern sense that describing intelligent design or speaking to the existence of God from what you see in nature is somehow anti-scientific, it's not at all. But if you are someone who has a naturalistic perspective, a naturalistic belief system, a materialistic belief system, and an atheistic belief system, then that's what you're going to come to. And in your belief system, instead of saying, I just want to see where the truth leads, you're going to say, the truth cannot be that there's a God. And that's biased. When we're talking about intelligent design, we're saying, hey, this makes more sense than a naturalistic explanation. So we're at least looking at both explanations and then saying, hey, this one makes more sense. But the atheist doesn't look at both. The atheist only looks at one and eliminates from a biased perspective the intelligent design perspective. And what we're saying is it needs to be back on the table. In fact, if anything should be taken off the table, it should be something like these ideas that are anti-scientific. See, if I'm going to take something off the table, let's take the abiogenesis idea off the table when it goes and flies in the face of a natural law called the law of biogenesis. If I'm going to go against something, let me go against biological evolution, which flies in the face of the idea of entropy, that things over time get worse, or they run down, or they become less efficient, rather than this idea of biological evolution where things improve over time. That's the opposite of the second law of thermodynamics and the corollaries to it that could be applied in the area of biology. The idea of genetic or biological entropy is a real thing that the traditional sense of evolution would actually oppose. So we see these ideas in the science, in natural laws, that are being opposed by these ideas simply because at least the idea is atheistic. This is what people want, but it's not scientific. So that bias against intelligent design isn't scientific. Okay, so that just gives you a little sense of that interview. And again, we're going to try a shorter format moving forward, try to keep it closer to 30 to 40 minutes and see how that does. And so I want to try to pack as much in a smaller period of time as possible. It looks like my camera might have turned off, but you should still be hearing my voice. We're going to try to get that camera fixed next week, and so that you'll at least be able to see me talking as well. That's it for this week. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith.